You did everything right. You worked hard. You spent less than you earned, and you saved. Every month, a little more went into the account. And one day you looked at the balance and felt it. That quiet, solid feeling of security. A number with a comma in it. Maybe two commas. Sitting right there in your bank account, untouched, protected, yours. That feeling is real. That pride is earned. But what if the thing you built that feeling on top of is slowly, silently, mathematically destroying you? This is not a story about bad people making bad decisions. This is a story about good people doing everything they were told and losing anyway. Let's start with a number. Say you have $30,000 in a standard savings account at a major bank. Not a checking account, a savings account, the one they specifically market to responsible people who want to grow their money safely. The average interest rate on that account right now is somewhere around 0.46% per year. That means at the end of 12 months, your $30,000 has earned you $138. Before taxes, you worked a full year of discipline and patience, and the bank handed you less than $12 a month. That is not a reward. That is an insult dressed up in the language of safety. But here is the part that most people never stop to think about. That $30,000 you deposited, the bank did not put in a vault. The bank did not keep it safe for you while you slept. The moment your money hit that account, the bank went to work with it. They lent it out to home buyers, to businesses, to credit card holders. And those borrowers are paying the bank anywhere from 7% to 24% in annual interest. The bank took your money, made it work like a machine, collected the profits, and mailed you $138 at the end of the year like it was doing you a favor. Think about that transaction clearly. You gave the bank $30,000. The bank used it to generate, conservatively, somewhere between $2,000 and $7,000 in interest income off your deposit alone. Then they gave you $138 and called it a savings product. That is not saving. That is subsidizing someone else's wealth while calling it your own. Now let's bring in the force that makes all of this even worse. Inflation. The slow, invisible tax that nobody voted for and almost nobody fully accounts for. In the United States, the long-run average inflation rate sits around 3% per year. What that means in plain language is this. Every year, the purchasing power of a dollar shrinks by roughly 3%. The dollar you have today will only buy 97 cents worth of goods next year. And a year after that, a little less again. And a year after that, less still. Let's go back to your $30,000. At 0.46% interest, after 1 year, you have $30,138. But inflation at 3% means that to buy the same things you could buy today with $30,000, you will need $30,900 next year. So in real terms, in actual purchasing power, you did not gain $138. You lost $762. You did everything right. You saved diligently, you did not touch it, and you still ended up poorer in the only way that actually matters, what your money can do in the world. This is called a negative real return, and it is the standard result of keeping money in a traditional savings account during any period when inflation runs higher than your interest rate, which is most of history, and certainly the world we are living in right now. 5 years of this, 10 years, 20 years. Run the numbers, and the picture becomes genuinely alarming. $30,000 sitting in a savings account for 20 years, earning 0.46% annually while inflation runs at 3%, ends up with a real purchasing power of roughly $16,500. You did not double your money. You almost cut it in half. In terms of what it can actually buy, your carefully saved $30,000 shrank to $16,500 in the time you were guarding it. And the most painful part is that you will never see this loss. It will not show up as a red number on your statement. Your account will say $33,000 or $34,000, and you'll feel like you are ahead. That is the cruelty of inflation. It does not take your money. It takes the value of your money. And it does it so slowly, so consistently, so quietly that most people do not notice until they try to retire and wonder why 30 years of saving doesn't feel like enough. Now here is where the thinking usually stops, and where it absolutely must not. The typical response to everything above is, fine, but at least it's safe. At least I cannot lose money. At least I can sleep at night knowing the number will not go down. And this is the trap. This is the exact mental trick that keeps millions of responsible, hardworking people in a state of slow financial decline while believing they are being responsible. Because the question is never just, is this safe? The question has to be safe compared to what? And when you ask it that way, the savings account stops looking safe at all. What is the alternative your money is being protected from? The stock market? Over any 20-year rolling period in the history of the S&P 500, the market has never delivered a negative return. Not once. In every single 20-year window, through wars, recessions, crashes, pandemics, political upheaval, anyone who simply held a broad index fund for 20 years came out ahead. The average annualized return over the last 100 years has been around 10% before inflation, or roughly 7% after. That is not a fantasy or a lucky scenario. That is what patient, boring, do-nothing investing has historically returned. Now, put that next to the savings account. 7% real return versus negative 2.5% real return. Over 20 years, that $30,000 invested in a broad market index fund grows to approximately $116,000 in real purchasing power. In the savings account, it became $16,500. The difference is $100,000. Not because of risky speculation, not because of luck or timing or any special knowledge, simply because the money was allowed to work instead of being kept still. The safe choice cost you $100,000. Tell me again which one is risky. The psychology behind this is deep, and it is human. Loss aversion. The documented tendency to fear losses roughly twice as much as we value equivalent gains is wired into us. Seeing a portfolio drop 10% in a bad quarter feels catastrophic, even if the money was up 40% over the previous 3 years. The pain of that paper loss overrides the rational calculation. So people sell, or they stay in cash, or they never invest in the first place because the idea of watching a number go down is unbearable. What they do not feel, because it is invisible, is the steady drain of inflation. You cannot watch purchasing power evaporate in real time. There is no red ticker showing you the value your savings account lost today. So it does not feel dangerous. It just feels stable. This is not stupidity. It is a design flaw in human perception. We are built to respond to visible threats and ignore invisible ones. A car swerving into your lane gets your full attention. A diet that is slowly, over 30 years, damaging your cardiovascular system does not feel like an emergency, even though it is statistically far more dangerous. The savings account is the same category of threat. Invisible, slow, and ultimately more damaging than the visible risks people are trying to avoid. Let's talk about the banks for a moment more, because the relationship between you and your bank is something most people have never been invited to examine honestly. The bank is not your partner. The bank is your customer. You are the supplier. You supply capital. The bank purchases that capital from you at the lowest possible price, currently 0.46%, and sells it on the market at a dramatically higher price. This is their entire business model, and is a perfectly legal, highly profitable one. There is nothing malicious about it, but there is something clarifying about seeing it clearly. When the bank shows you a beautiful app with your balance prominently displayed, when they send you a debit card with your name embossed on it, when the teller smiles and calls you by name, all of that is customer relationship management. You are not the customer being served. You are the product being acquired. Your deposits are their raw material. The friendlier the experience, the longer you keep your money there, the more they earn from lending it out. They have every incentive to keep you comfortable, compliant, and unquestioning. The language of banking reinforces this. They call it a savings account, not a minimum interest loan you make to us. They talk about protecting your money, not holding it temporarily while we deploy it for our own returns. The framing is always oriented toward your comfort and their interests simultaneously. And it works, not because people are gullible, but because most people were never given a different frame to compare it against. Here's a question worth sitting with. How did the advice to put your money in the bank become the definition of financial responsibility? It was not always this way. For most of human history, wealth was stored in land, in trade goods, in livestock, in productive assets, things that generated returns. The cultural norm of parking cash in a low-interest deposit account is largely a 20th century phenomenon, one that emerged alongside mass banking and was reinforced by financial institutions that had an obvious interest in promoting it. The 1950s and 60s did offer savings account rates that occasionally kept pace with inflation, sometimes even exceeded it. If you grew up watching your parents bank that way, or if you learned personal finance from people who lived through that era, the advice made sense in its original context. But the context changed. Interest rates dropped. Inflation persisted. The old strategy became quietly destructive, but the cultural instruction did not update. People kept doing what they were told was responsible, in a world where that behavior no longer produced responsible outcomes. This is not about blame. It is about updating your understanding to match current reality rather than inherited assumption. Now, the point of all this is not to make you feel foolish. It is not to tell you that you wasted years or that the discipline it took to save was wrong. Discipline is never wrong. The habit of spending less than you earn is the foundation everything else is built on. Without that habit, there's nothing to redirect, nothing to work with, no conversation to have. The savings habit is correct. The destination for those savings needs examination. Because here is the real message underneath everything said so far. You are not out of time. The person reading this at 40 or 45 or 52 who has been faithfully saving into a standard account for 15 years. You are not behind in the way that feels final. The $100,000 gap between the savings account and the index fund over 20 years, that gap is made up of compounding, and compounding does not care when you start. It only cares that you start. 20 years of correct behavior, starting today, still produces the same result. 15 years of correct behavior, starting today, still produces a dramatic difference. Even 10. What does correct behavior look like? At its simplest, it looks like this. Keep 3 to 6 months of living expenses in liquid savings. Actual cash in an actual account, immediately accessible. That is your emergency fund, and it belongs exactly where it is. It serves its function, stability, accessibility, zero risk of being unavailable when you need it. Beyond that buffer, money that is sitting idle, money you do not expect to need for 5 or more years, should be working, not gambling, not speculating, not picking individual stocks based on something you heard. Working in a boring, diversified, low-cost index fund that tracks the broad market and demands nothing of you except patience. That is the whole strategy. Keep what needs to be liquid, liquid. Put what does not need to be liquid to work. Stop confusing stillness with safety. The people who end up genuinely financially secure, not just comfortable for a decade, but actually free by the time they reach their 60s, almost universally share one trait. Not high income, not a lucky investment, not inheritance. They understood at some point that time in the market beats everything else. They stopped waiting for the right moment to invest and started understanding that every moment they delayed was a moment of compounding lost forever. They made peace with the fact that their portfolio balance would fluctuate, and they learned to see that fluctuation as noise rather than threat. And they let the math do what math does when you give it enough time. You have everything you need to be that person. The savings habit is already in place. The discipline is already demonstrated. The income is already there. What has been missing, not through any failure of character or intelligence, but through a failure of information, is the understanding that the safe road and the profitable road are not the same road, and that the road most people choose because it feels secure is actually the one that leads them quietly, invisibly, into a diminished retirement. The account is full. The balance is real. The pride you feel is legitimate. None of that changes. What changes now is where the work happens next. Not because you have to, not out of desperation, but because you finally see the whole picture. You can count the money and know what it is worth, not just what it says. And knowing the difference is the beginning of everything.